Welcome, everyone. My name is Lars Vestly, and the Department of Psychology has appointed me as Chair of Defense for Henrik Herrebrøden's public dissertation today. Psychol, Henrik Herrebrøden, will later today defend his dissertation publicly for the PhD degree. The title of the dissertation is Attention and Effort in Elite Athletes, a Case Against Automaticity. Henrik Herrebrøden will now give his trial lecture. The topic for the lecture was set by the committee. He will lecture on task-relevant information, underpinnings, and predictions in light of broader theoretical perspectives. Henrik Herrebrøden, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Sound is good? Awesome. Thank you so much to the committee, to the organizers, to all my friends and family here. Very exciting for me. So again, the title is Task-Relevant Information, Underpinnings and Predictions in Light of Broader Theoretical Perspectives. So in other words, we'll deal with information and we'll see, can we use task-relevant information to predict performance? So in other words, sometimes we succeed and sometimes we fail. Can we have a look at attention to relevant information and see if that can explain why we sometimes succeed and sometimes fail? But this is a lot of words, so I think we need to unpack this. We need to provide some definitions. So here's our plan for today. I'll start by sort of giving a broad context. I think information would be one of the more common terms in psychology. It's frequently studied. So let's see how this fits in psychology in general. So first of all, can we understand the filtering of information as a case of selective attention more broadly? And then we'll move on to the more specific context, which will be performance. Before that, we will have to define what do I mean by information, what does task relevance mean? And we'll provide some theory. What are the underpinnings of this so that we can understand what it means to perceive some information and make meaning out of this world and stimuli. So that will lead us to the predictions. The final part, can we predict performance? And we'll focus on motor performance. So cases where you move your body to achieve some goal. So first, I think information fits with the general idea that we have a selective attention. The ability to filter what is relevant for me and what is not relevant. So consider, for example, let's say you're at a festival and you try to find your friend. And there's a lot of stuff going on, but you know what your friend looks like, and there he is. You found him, and now you can even maybe talk to the person. Even though there's noise, maybe you can filter out the noise if you can hear the person, or maybe you can read their lips. Maybe you can understand, okay, he's smiling, he's happy to see me, okay. So I think this is a skill that we need to survive in a world of chaos, and I think we take this for granted. I don't think we appreciate this in our daily lives, so I would like to show what it may be like when this fails. For some people, this fails, this ability to filter what's relevant, what's not relevant. And you could go with many cases, many different diagnoses, but I'll go with autism as an example. So I would like to show you a video by an organization trying to show what it's like to be autistic when you navigate around the world. So autism consists of many problems. Some are emotional, some are relational, but it has also to do with selective attention. There are several studies on this, on how this breaks down in autistic people. So for example, there's this study from 2002, basically showing they see the world differently. They have a much more difficult time to distinguish what's relevant, what's not relevant. And to them, it's not so easy to see the clear, okay, so I look for this, separate that from the noise. So they may see the person, and even if they see the person, they struggle to make sense of their face. So what does that mean? What's their emotion? And as a consequence, they are scared a lot of the time. So that was my first point, is that we need this to survive, but we also need this to perform. So now we'll turn our focus to performance. Let's say we would like to perform on a given task. I would argue that selective attention is key in most cases. So we'll have a look at a video that I think many of you have seen before. And that's okay, because it makes a point in any case. But if you haven't seen it before, I think the video explains what you're supposed to do. So you guys will be given a task. You'll be asked to pay attention to something. And here goes.
This is a test of selective attention. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball. How many passes did you count? The correct answer is 15 passes. But did you see the gorilla? This video is from research by Dan.
So I typically get 1 out of 2 responses. The first one is, I didn't see the gorilla. I didn't see the gorilla the first time. Or the second one is, yeah, I saw the gorilla, but I didn't care, because I was focused on my task. And in that case, this illustrates one of the more classic points on the bottleneck of attention. Came in the 50s first, so that if you attend to certain stimuli intensely, you don't have capacity for too much else. And of course, there's been numerous studies since the 50s, and you have various additions of the bottleneck and updates, but the main idea holds. If you want to perform, the key is to stay focused, and this has major implications for performance in any given context. For example, if you're up for an exam, or you are going to compete in sports, one of the more common problems is that people find themselves distracted. So for example, they think about the past. Last time it didn't go so well, or I made a mistake. Or the future, what if I fail? Or what if I win? So we can all sort of agree, the main tip, if you want to avoid distractions, people keep saying, I don't want to be distracted. And they say, let's block out distractions. The key is not to block out distractions. The key is to zoom in on something. So we can all sort of agree, the classic, it's almost cliche, stay in the moment, be present, focus on the present. But this still opens up for a wide variety of cues. So the next big question is, what should you focus on when you would like to perform? So for example, in the golf example, if you eliminate all the irrelevant stuff, there are still tons of options. And that brings us to the more specific context of this presentation, which is motor performance, task-related focus. How can we use a focus that will actually help us? Because you can still have focus that will not help you. So one way to categorize is to distinguish between two main types of focus, which has typically been done in the sports science literature, and also motor performance, rehab, music. First, you have one option, which is internal focus. So let's say you want to shoot a golf ball, you can focus on your body, the movement itself, internal, within you. So for example, focus on arm swing. And this is a very typical cue in golf. Keep a straight left arm, for example. The other option is don't think about your body, go outside your body, external, to the consequence that your movement will have on the environment. So how will my movement affect some object or the environment? So for example, the golf club. If I move my hand or arm, I will move the golf club. And this is an actual study, comparing focus on arm swing with focus on club swing. And numerous studies on this, from piano, which I will show you later, from rehab, people relearning how to walk after a stroke, internal focusing on their feet, external focusing on the ground. And the results are probably among the more consistent findings in sports psychology. It's very one-sided, suggesting one of these two is better, and it's external focus being better. It's so consistent it has its own name. The attentional focus effect. Your performance should benefit from you attending to something outside yourself, to external stimuli. And Chua, for example, the most recent review, over 100 studies, more than 3,000 participants, all seemingly pointing in the same direction. And as a consequence, the main recommendation, do not focus on your body. And the main mechanism behind this, which will lead us to today's topic in a second, is automaticity. If you focus on external things and don't care about your body, things will go well. And conversely, according to the constrained action hypothesis, if you focus on your body, you will be more constrained than what you should be. You will be more restricted. You will not allow your subconscious reflex-like processing to occur, and as a consequence, your performance will be suboptimal. And there are a few issues with this, which will lead us to the alternative view discussed today. So one issue is there's actually a lot of sports performance that seems not to be automatic. Conceptually, first of all, I mean, it makes sense that sometimes you would have to plan, and you cannot be subconscious for a whole performance. For example, if you're doing a continuous sport, takes a long time, you would expect some adjustment, conscious thinking, changes, and also empirical work suggesting even elites, experts, need to think, need to process sometimes. And the second issue is, and this is a big issue, is that internal focus can actually be beneficial, which is a problem if your argument is that internal will cause disrupted automaticity. So let's just cut to the chase. Let's have a look at an alternative view. Let's see if this view of external leading to automaticity, leading to better performance, can be replaced. And this is what we'll have a look at. So the argument is external, internal can both work if they provide you with task-relevant information, leading you to better performance. And some cues have more information than others, explaining performance. So here's the remainder of our plan. Task-relevant information, attunement or processing, as the terminology suggests. This can fit into different frameworks. So first of all, the first thing we need to do is define information, define task relevance, see how it fits in an ecological approach and information processing approach, and we'll get back to what that means. And let's see if we can use that to actually predict performance in motor contexts, and I will use different examples of motor performance. A lot of them will be sports. for a few reasons. So, first of all, as you can see in this picture, sports tends to involve very complex stimuli and environments, where there's lots of stuff going on. So you can see Lionel Messi, there's the ball, there's the opponent, there's a crowd, lots of things going on. So it's complex. And the interesting thing about sports is that performers will tend to have access to a lot of the same information. So Lionel Messi will have access to a lot of the same cues as opposed to you and me. It seems like he's making a little bit better use of that information than at least me. So equal access. And the third point is it's quite easy to determine, was this success or was it failure in sports? Whereas in everyday life, we tend to fail all the time and we can make up excuses. Maybe it's not so clear. Was that good? Was it bad? In sports, it tends to be very clear. So we'll have a look at more performance where there is a clear outcome measure, where we can determine, was this a good or bad performance? But like I said, before we predict anything, we should define the terms and give them some theory. So information, what does that mean? One way to understand information is to have a look at the term itself. Information. So let's use an example. If this was a piece of art, it would be quite abstract. It's not very meaningful. I don't know what to make of it. But if they align, information. It's information. So the stimuli are no longer just random. They are related to one another, and they are meaningful. They are non-ambiguous. They're not perfect. You can see the lines are somewhat off, somewhat misaligned, but they are good enough so that you can make sense of this. It's an arrow. I can go that way, for example. So what does task-relevant information mean? Meaning stimuli that constrain or guide you towards the goal or purpose of whatever you do. Constraining means it has to take certain options away. The abstract stimuli we saw takes no options away in the sense that we can't make sense. They have to constrain, reduce the degrees of freedom towards something meaningful for your task. And this, by Vicente and Wang, was very much inspired by Gibson and ecological psychology. So let's go a little bit deeper to the theoretical underpinnings to see how do we make sense of stimuli, turn them into information that allows us to act. For example, if we would like to, let's say we would like to sit down. This is you. And you see this object, and you cannot quite make sense of it at first. It's like, I would like to sit. But what is this? And what is it that makes you able to see that this is something that I can sit on? According to Gibson and this approach, all the information is in the stimuli. The stimuli has specifying information that tells you this is a chair. This is not something else. In two ways. First of all, it affords something. It invites you. It affords a certain action. It invites you. It gives you an invitation to sit. So for example, maybe you see the flat surface and you think, oh, this is perfect for sitting. It also has constraints. So it has these sort of edges. It's not just a flat surface going on forever. So it's perfect for sitting because of the affordance and the constraints. And whether or not you make sense of this is totally your responsibility. Via attunement, if you pick up this information, which is already there, you can sit, you can make sense. If you don't pick up that information, if you're not attuned, if you haven't educated your attention to these cues, you will not sit. And you'll also have to act. Maybe explore, maybe move around, see the thing from different sides. In this view, that way you can sit, and action, perception, the environment is very much linked. And information does not just come to you in a passive sense, you will have to come to the information. And we'll have a look at what this means in football in a minute. So you will have to go after the information, it's already there. So let's just contrast this with what is sometimes seen as an opposing view, the information processing approach. In this case, the stimuli doesn't really make sense. The stimuli are just stimuli. It's kind of chaos. The reason why you think this is a chair has to do with your knowledge and processing. So you may go, okay, I've seen this before. You have a schema, which is a body of knowledge containing this is a chair, I've seen it, I've seen people sit, I can sit. That way it makes meaning and gives you the output. So the outcome is the same. You turn stimuli into meaningful information, but the process, the way you get there, is totally different. But it works in both cases. You need stimuli that can tell you something. So let's just, before we predict, here's sort of the rationale. You depend on stimuli with task-relevant information, and since your performance context will change, have different stimuli, different goals, what you try to accomplish will differ, then we can predict certain things. First of all, there should be task-focused congruence so that different tasks may require different focus. Certain tasks will be perfect for certain cues. And the second one is, since your context will change, your focus should change. And the reason why I say that is a lot of the studies on attentional focus will only use one cue. They will give you one cue, here's your external cue, use it throughout the whole performance. And we'll see some examples of more ecologically valid studies suggesting self-regulation of attention, the fact that you can adjust your attention to perform. So let's start with probably the most dominant sense, one could argue, at least in sports, vision. If you were given the dilemma, go into sport and you can only bring one sense, I think I would choose vision a lot of the time. And if your context requires you to have spatial understanding, so for example, I need to go there, I need to aim for that, or I need to find some space, it makes sense that you should have visual attentional cues that will help you perform in that way. So that could, for example, explain the attentional focus effect in aiming tasks. Tasks where you try to aim at something, where visual external cues tend to help you get a good result. So let's do an example. You try to hit the center of the dartboard, the bullseye. That's your task. And these are two studies. If you're in the internal condition, you focus on your arm swing and the hand releasing the dart. Classic internal focus. Focus on the body parts that are involved in the movement. Whereas if you're in the external condition, they will tell you focus on the bullseye. And that's it. And toss when you're ready. And another one, air pistol shooting, focus on your shoulder, or focus on the sight, the frontal part of your gun that will sort of tell you if you're aiming correctly. So the results, as you might have guessed, external focus is better, and the classical explanation is offered. This has to do with automaticity. You hit the bullseye because the external focus cue telling you to attend to the bullseye leads to automaticity. Whereas if you start with information and ask, where is the most relevant information? I would probably say the bullseye. If I were to have one just piece of knowledge, okay, what am I doing? I'm aiming for bullseye, I would probably attend to bullseye. Or the sight telling me if I aim correctly. So in that sense, you can say that maybe automaticity, but wouldn't visual demands require visual cues because of that's where the relevant information is? So let's go a little bit more specific. If we expect that visual demands will be benefited, visually demanding contexts will benefit from visual cues, we should expect that experts, those that are best in their field, will exploit and use a lot of the information. And that's exactly what they have researched and found over the last 20 years or so, especially in football. So one consistent finding is that skilled football players will not be too interested in the ball. They will tend to look around a lot when they play football. So for example, Frank Lampard. So he's like constantly looking around, almost like he's afraid of something. And the question is, why would he do that? Is that just for fun? Or is it because he finds relevant information? He looks for information, the visual demands of the task causing him to scan and look around more often. If you accept that, we can start to do more specific studies, like they have done at the Norwegian School of Sports Science, with eye tracking. So where do they look? Now we can become more specific. If we accept that we have information, where is the information? And we can use eye tracking. Sorry about the disturbing sound, but I've heard worse. So now we have established that we can measure this. The next question is, can we predict where a footballer might look in a very specific situation based on where they may find the most task-relevant information? And I would like to give you some examples from penalty kicks. I will show you two clips of two of the most not famous, but two of the best penalty kick shooters in football. And they have two completely different styles. They are both very successful, but they have completely different styles. And we'll start with Jorginho from Italy. Very strange technique where he jumps in the air, and his whole tactic is to place the ball to the opposite side of the goalkeeper. He's not very precise. It can be just to the side of center. It's not very hard. To him, the key is to go the opposite way from the goalkeeper. So this is what it looks like.
Или Андре Онана. Внимание, удар и счет. Выйдет на поле, а удар поворотом и счет. Versus Zaniga.
Pulem z karnego Jorginho. Jak będzie dziś Jorginho?
So where would he might look? Where's the most task-relevant information for him? The goalkeeper. It makes sense that he would look at the goalkeeper. That's where the information is for him. Let's see what it looks like with Harry Kane. Totally different approach. Strikes the ball with power, precise, very often to the same side as the goalkeeper. So to him, it's almost as if he doesn't care as much about the goalkeeper. Here's what it looks like.
Kane scored! No! England awarded a penalty, which up.
With the chance to equal.
So that last one, for example, the goalkeeper goes the right way, but he still scores. So to Kane, what's the most relevant cue where you can find information to strike hard and precise the ball? So let's do one more. Can we predict where they might look based on skill? How skilled you are? For example, expert versus novice, and Abernathy and colleagues have done a lot of work on this. And one consistent finding is that experts look in different places from a novice, and it tends to be more around the core area of the opponent's body. Why? Because this is where most motion starts. If I go this way, I will start moving my hip before my feet will go. So if you would like to know where I go, and you have the ability to anticipate, you should look at my hip. If you're not as skilled, if you need to focus on the ball, controlling the ball, you would expect a different kind of vision. So this is actually quite nicely illustrated in a video with Cristiano Ronaldo.
There's no doubt that Ronaldo's feet are fast and effective, but what part does his mind play in this ability? The eye trackers show intriguing results. On the replay, the little red dot shows exactly what Ronaldo's looking at.
You'd expect a lot of players to be focused on the ball the whole time. With Ronaldo, he did look at the ball a fair amount of time, but he was much more looking around, looking at the defender and taking in the information from his body, and also scanning for the spaces beyond the defender.
Andy, on the other hand, can't afford to take his eyes off the ball because he doesn't have quite the same ability to predict where the ball is going.
So again, how interesting is the ball? Depends on your skill. Based on your skill, we can somehow predict where you might want to look and perhaps even guide your attention to more relevant cues. So that was vision. Let's turn to a different type of information, sound, and see if that can help you if you're doing a timing task. And auditory cues are perhaps more used in music than sports, which makes sense because sound is music in a lot of cases. So let's have a look at a study with piano playing using internal and external focus. So Duke and colleagues invited participants, which was a sample of musicians, to play a 13-note keyboard sequence with a certain tempo. And they had a metronome. So here's the tempo guiding you. Here's what it should be like. And the outcome measure was how temporally even was this. So how much in line with the tempo, the metronome, were you? Internal focus, kind of a classic one with focus on your hands. 3 different external ones, focus on the keys, focus on the hammer producing the sound, or focus on the sound itself. And as you might have guessed, sound produced better performance. And they, again, argue is this automaticity. That you listen, you don't think about your hands, you just move. Or could it be there is something about auditory stimuli offering more precise information that now something happens. With a high temporal resolution, precision allowing you to perceive in real time what's going on. And there's a few studies suggesting the answer is yes, it could be something about the information. So a couple of studies. If you were a part of this, you would be sitting down on a computer with a keyboard, and you would only use 2 keys, one to go left and one to go right. And it's kind of like playing Snake on your phone, the old Nokia phone. So you will be given a template. So here's the pattern you're supposed to produce. Now you can produce it. And the way to produce this pattern is to have precise timing of pressing to go the different ways. So if you're in the visual condition, that's all you receive, this. And they also had an auditory condition, something like this. To me at least, it's something about the sound, making it a bit more easy to realize, okay, this is when I'm supposed to press. And that's exactly what the results suggest. So again, is it automaticity, or does the sound contain very specific relevant information to produce a certain timing pattern? And this is what they have started to explore in sports. McPherson and colleagues have worked with athletics and javelin, for example, with a very precise pattern of timing, which is unique to each performer, of every footfall being in a very specific timing pattern that you can sonify. You can add sound to it, and this clip doesn't have sound, but I'll just show you in slow motion that every time the foot falls to the ground, it will create sound. And perhaps this is something that we should bring to the athletes' awareness. And I think there are a few studies on this, but it needs to be more future work. So I think sound could be one venue if we accept that it may offer information. And the last type of processing or attunement would be proprioception, which is what we typically associate with body feel. Feel your body, feel your movement. Where's my arm? How's it moving? And the question is, and the reason why this is somewhat controversial is this basically means internal focus, focusing on your body, which we're not supposed to do, but there's a study that have tried to make the body information important and seen if that will make internal cues important. So here's a study. If you're a part of this, again, you're by the computer, your task is to move the green arrow to one of the 3 red targets, something like this. And we will measure how fast are you and how accurate are you. You move the cursor with a pen, but you can't see the pen. It's blocked from your vision. So in other words, a very fine-tuned movement with restricted visual access to the external cue. Internal focus, focus on your hand. External focus, focus on the pen. Focus on the fluid motion of your hand, focus on the fluid motion of the pen. And the results suggest better performance with internal. Again, causing a bit of a problem if you're with the automaticity perspective. So could it also be that in this case, there was actually a lot of information in the internal? Again, not too much on sports, but one suggestion by the authors is that, for example, in this case, in gymnastics, you have an athlete trying to control the ball, but they can't see the ball. So what type of information would you have in this case? Maybe internal, in that case. Where's the information? In your body, because you have restricted vision. So that was task focus congruence. If your focus is congruent, fitting with the task, what you try to accomplish, you may expect different cues, diversity, not just external diversity. Last prediction, if you participate in a sport, for example, cycling, consider cycling. You have the start, where there are tons of people around you. You have a middle section, maybe you're on your own for a while, maybe you go up a hill, you climb, maybe you sprint. So the question is, with such different contexts, wouldn't it be sensible to also change your focus? Again, a typical study with external, internal would be one focus, but what happens if you just ask researchers to do a study where you just investigate what are they thinking about without giving them the cue? So for example, Whitehead and colleagues, the Think Aloud, they ask athletes to think aloud while they perform. And they find different things. And this is across a sample. So for example, one cyclist may say, okay, I'm on target, slightly over, prepared to catch him. So to me, seems like kind of an external focus on your opponent. You focus on your environment. Whereas a different case is keep my head down, relax the shoulders, which to me seems a bit internal or distraction. And I guess it's internal because it's your hair. So my point is, one prediction would be that especially experts should have the flexibility to self-regulate. Since the context is changing, the performers should also have to change. And this is summed up in the mesh model, a theory on cognition and expertise. Expert awareness will be selective, highly shaped to task demands, may often roam or float, flexibly, anticipatively seeking out important information. And it will often include forms of self-regulation to put you in an optimal state. And if you are not in the optimal state, you should definitely be able to adjust. And this is some work by Robatza and colleagues, where they asked performers to describe some core components, which is some key components of your action that you may attend to. And here's one example of a shooter. Body balance, hand grip, breathing, these are internal. Alignment seems like an external one. So this is within the same individual, not just a sample, within the same person. And I think this illustrates nicely the point that you should not just have one focus. It may differ, and it should probably, depending on your context, your skill, personal attributes, not just one, self-regulate. To sum up, I think it makes sense to consider task relevance not just in terms of a dichotomy where you have irrelevant and relevant. I think you should have degrees of relevance. In selective attention, you should consider something more or less relevant or irrelevant depending on your context. And I think the task-relevant information mechanism can account for a few things. First of all, performance across cues, so external, internal, not just one. Contexts, different sports, different tasks, different skills. It doesn't say no matter who you are, it says it maybe depend on who you are. And theories, ecological approaches, information processing approaches. It should have a place for task-relevant information, offering a little bit more sensible explanations in more cases than automaticity, especially if you're with certain frameworks. Again, automatic and non-automatic actions, which is comforting, so then you don't have to argue it's all automatic. You can account for different types of performances, like the mesh model, the map model. You might even suggest there might be automaticity sometimes, maybe not sometimes. You can account for findings beyond the attentional focus effect. So again, for example, scanning in football. You don't have to just focus on external, internal. You can go beyond this to related phenomena, like the scanning behavior, which is a good example of Gibson, the animal going after the information. You act to perceive, you don't just perceive to act. And you can be both specific, predict this task will favor this focus, and also predict variability. Self-regulation. So overall, I think this is a parsimonious concept, opening up some interesting venues for future research. Thank you.
Thank you, Henrik. So this concludes the first session of the defense. I would like to remind you all that the next session, the actual public defense, will take place in the same room and will start at 12:15. So welcome back. So, dear everyone, my name is Lars Westlø, and the Department of Psychology has appointed me as Chair of Defense for Henrik Herrebrøden's public disputation. Psychol Henrik Herrebrøden is about to defend his doctorate thesis entitled Attention and Effort in Elite Athletes, a Case Against Automaticity. On the 2nd of March 2023, Henrik Herrebrøden submitted his thesis to the University of Oslo and requested the opportunity to defend it for a doctoral degree. Associate Professor Jonna Katarina Woskowski from Ritmo at the Department of Musicology and the Department of Psychology here at the University of Oslo has been his main supervisor. Professor and director of Ritmo, Alexander Jensenius, and researcher Laura Bishop have been the co-supervisors, and they are both from Ritmo. Following the proposal by the Department of Psychology, the Faculty of Social Sciences appointed the following people to serve on the evaluation committee. First opponent is Professor Claudio Rabazza. Second opponent, Amy Whitehead, Dr. Amy Whitehead from the University of Liverpool in the UK. And third internal coordinator has been Associate Professor Tor Endestad from the Department of Psychology here at the University of Oslo. The committee has come to the anonymous conclusion that the thesis is worthy of defense. The Faculty of Social Sciences has agreed to this. And earlier today, the candidate held his trial lecture, and the topic for this lecture was set by the committee. The title was Task Relevant Information, Underpinnings and Predictions in Light of a Broader Theoretical Perspectives. The committee found that the trial lecture was held to their satisfaction. What will now follow is the viva, or the public defense, of the thesis. The following two people have been appointed to serve as official opponents. Professor Claudio Rabazza as the first opponent, and Dr. Reader Amy Whitehead as second opponent. Everyone in this room will be entitled to serve as an ex auditorio opponent. If anyone present wishes to do so, he or she will be given the chance to speak after the two opponents. And if you are interested in doing this, you are asked to report the request to me before I invite the second opponent to begin, so in the break between the first and second opponent. Today's schedule will be as follows. The first opponent will give an account of the thesis, followed by the discussion between him and the candidate. This will last for approximately 1 hour 15 minutes, which is approximately until 1:45. We will then have a break of 15 minutes. And please remember that the schedule is tentative and is up to the dynamics of the discussions. After the break, we will hear from the second opponent. Finally, any ex auditorio opponents will be yielded the floor. I hereby call on the first opponent.
Okay. So, first of all, I want to thank you very much for inviting me here to present this thesis and to discuss this, what I think a very important topic in research. Is one of my favorite topics and is also very much debated in the current literature. And yeah. The thesis discusses the concept of automaticity in the execution of motor skills, particularly in the context of sport performance. The thesis is based on 3 studies conducted to explore the relationship between mental effort, attention, and performance, motor performance among elite and non-elite rowers. This is the primary aim of this research, to investigate the relationship between mental effort, attentional focus, and motor performance. The thesis starts by introducing the concept of automaticity, which posits that with practice, motor skills become less dependent on conscious attention and effort, allowing individuals to perform tasks more effortlessly. Many studies published in the extant literature have supported this notion, but by demonstrating that skilled athletes perform better when they focus on external cues, or cues that are related to the performance, that are important for the performance. And they try to demonstrate that then when athletes pay attention to an external focus or to external cues, their performance is better. And in particular, the thesis discusses the different perspective on the role of mental effort in elite sports. It introduces two contrasting viewpoints: the low effort or automated approach to the learning and the execution of the movement, and the high effort or control approach. In the low effort approach, the experts are believed to perform with little or to very low, not conscious at all, attention, relying on automatic processes developed through years of practice. This perspective suggests that too much cognitive control can disrupt performance, optimal performance. On the other hand, the high effort view posits that the cognitive control remains crucial, even for elite athletes, for elite performers, and deliberate practice is necessary. Also, focus attention are essential for improvement. The dissertation acknowledges that there are challenges in studying cognition in sports due to the physical demands of the execution to the movement, and that cognition in sport is also relatively limited. And tasks usually are conducted in laboratory settings, and they are very, very easy. They do not reflect the complexity of the sport environment, such as, for example, golf putting or dart throwing or grasping objects. And this limitation, of course, raises concerns about the generalizability, the transferability of the findings from simple motor tasks to more complex real-world sport scenarios. Moreover, the thesis highlights that many cognitive theories are primarily based on study of cognitive tasks, such as arithmetics, for example, reading, rather than motor tasks that can be found in a real sport environment. And this, of course, raises questions about the validity of the results and the applicability of cognitive theories to post-sport performance, especially given the significant motor component that are involved in sport. So, to address these limitations, the dissertation distinguishes between selective and intensive attention focus. And the focus is particularly on intensive attention, which is less well understood and studied in the sport context. And the research evidence from psychophysiological studies, dual tasks, and self-reports is presented along with supporting theories. Some of these theoretical viewpoints advocate for low mental effort in elite sport performance, such as the choking under pressure model, reinvestment theory, constraint national hypothesis. Some of them have been mentioned during the presentation this morning. But in contrast, there are other theories, other theoretical approaches that suggest that high mental effort in motor expert is present, including the long-term working memory model, the multi-action plan, the master theory, the flow and clutch states model, and the mesh model. Drawing on these theoretical perspectives, the main research question of the dissertation is formulated in this way. To what extent do elite athletes' performance rely on mental effort? And in the attempt to answer these questions, 3 studies published in authoritative peer-reviewed journal are presented. In the first paper, titled Mental Effort in Elite and Non-Elite Rowers, published in Journal Sport and Exercise Psychology very recently, in the first study, recruited a total of 9 elite rowers from Norwegian national rowing team and 9 rowers from various Norwegian rowing clubs. The participants were asked to perform rowing trials on a rowing ergometer under various conditions. In particular, participants row at different physical intensities, either 75% or 85% of their maximum race speed, and they were instructed to row with different levels of cognitive load. The low cognitive task was focused, the athletes were asked to focus solely on rowing at a constant speed. In the medium cognitive load, the focus was also on rowing at a constant speed and follow a pre-established plan, a race plan, with a specific task-related cues. The high cognitive load, the focus was again on rowing at different speed and solve arithmetic problems. The researchers measure rowing speed, both its variability and deviation from target speed, as a performance measure. They also collected data on self-reported mental effort through questionnaires and used eye tracking technology to gather psychophysiological measure of effort, including blink rates and changes in pupil size compared to baseline. The study findings indicated several key points. Both elite and non-elite rowers were similarly affected by change in task load, suggesting that skill level didn't significantly impact how they responded to increased cognitive demands. A second point, increasing cognitive load led to less precise control of rowing speed on the ergometer, indicating that higher mental demands affected the ability to maintain a consistent pace. Self-reported measure, in addition, of mental effort, as well psychophysiological indicators like blink rates and pupil dilations, showed that rowers perceived and experienced increased mental effort as cognitive load intensified. Notably, the study found that elite rowers invested significantly more mental effort compared to their non-elite counterparts, as can be shown in this picture, as demonstrated by pupil size measurement. So there were differences by skill level and across the mental load. With a high mental load, the athletes reported more pupil dilation. In conclusion, the study challenges previous findings and theories, proposing that expert motor performance depend more on automatic and low-effort cognitive processes compared to beginners. In a second study published in Human Movement Science, this study investigated the effect of cognitive and physical load, again on rowers' kinematics, and data from the same sample of the first study were examined to understand how cognitive load and physical load impacted the rower's technique, the kinematics, across a skill level. The participants were subjected to conditions involving low and high cognitive load, single task rowing or rowing while solving arithmetical problems, and low and high physical load, rowing at 75% or 85% or maximum speed. Motion capture recordings were used to collect the data on fundamental aspects of rowing technique. As predicted, the study findings indicated that cognitive load had several effects on rowing kinematics. Specifically, when cognitive load increased while rowing, while solving arithmetic problems, rowers displayed tighter coordination between leg and trunk motion, shorter strokes, and reduced movement fluidity. Importantly, there were no significant differences in these kinematic measures between elite and non-elite rowers, and cognitive load affected both groups similarly. In conclusion, the study findings suggested that in response to increased cognitive load, rowers, regardless of their skill level, adopted motor patterns characterized by novice behavior. This adaptation is seen as a strategy to manage attentional resources and indicates a reliance on attentional control rather than complete automaticity. In essence, the results indicated that rowers at all skill levels appear to use their attentional resources rather than relying on automaticity when faced with cognitive load. In summary, these findings again challenge the notion of automaticity in elite athletes and suggest that attentional resources are crucial even for highly skilled individuals. In a third and last paper published in Journal of Motor Behavior, this is a review paper. This paper acknowledges the extensive body of research on the attentional focus effect, which suggests that focusing externally on the outcome or object of a movement rather than internally on one's own body movement is more beneficial for motor learning and performance. It has been widely assumed that internal focus disrupts subconscious, fast, and reflective processes during motor actions. And this assumption has been attributed to the concept of automaticity. But this is not always true. It's a part of the reality, just a part. So the conventional explanation for the attentional focus effect has been rooted in the ideas of automaticity, namely the belief that directing one's attention internally interferes with the automatic subconscious processes that underlie skill motor performance. And this has been used to support theories arguing that athletes should not focus on the execution of their movements. But also this is not always true. So Dr. Herrebrøden, however, highlights flaws in previous research on attentional focus on these positions. He suggests that while automaticity has been the predominant explanation, there are alternative mechanisms that may better account for the observed effects. The paper indicates that task-relevant information processing might provide a more convincing explanation for the attentional focus effect than automaticity. It suggests that the previous studies may have been biased by providing more task-relevant information in external focus conditions, or by giving internal instruction that disrupt optimal movement patterns. So, in conclusion, these papers and the entire thesis challenge the conventional automaticity-based explanation of the attentional focus effect and offers compelling arguments and research evidence in favor of task-relevant information processing as a more accurate mechanism. Additionally, it emphasizes the significance of assessing the meaningfulness of attentional cues and questions the idea that athletes should consistently avoid internal focus of attention. The strong conclusion put forward by some researchers in favor of an external focus, and the dismissal of an internal focus appear unfounded. Therefore, I believe that the studies conducted for this thesis, have the potential to contribute substantially to current knowledge of the effects of attention and effort in athletes and other performers, offering a new and original perspective for the study and understanding of these topics. Tack skal du ha. This is the only word I know in Norwegian. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this nice summary. Now I would like to invite the candidate to take the floor, please.
Okay, this was the easy part, now is the tough part. So, drawing on your research, I have several questions, maybe too many questions. Some theoretical topics and other more applied topics. For example, one area is could be the replication studies in different sports, but can involve interaction with teammates. For example, this morning you presented some videos regarding soccer in particular. So this is an example of interaction with teammates and in open skill sport performance. And this can be team performance, such as soccer or volleyball or other sports, or individual performance, such as fencing, for example. So, based on this finding, the finding of your work, do you think it would be possible to conduct replication studies in those different sports that involve interaction with teammates and involve the execution of open skill tasks? Because rowing is could be classified as an close skill task.
Yes, I think it's a very good question. And a weakness in my study, the lab study, was the lack of open aspects. You could argue that on-water rowing in a real competition will have some open aspects. You have to adapt to your opponents to some extent. Maybe if an opponent sprints, you may attend to those stimuli, and you may also adapt to waves and currents. And that was the main lacking thing in our design, was that we used an ergometer, which makes the activity a very closed activity. So I hope this can point to some future opportunities with more ecologically valid designs and more open aspects. And my prediction in that case would be even more mental effort. And I think this is covered by some researchers also, Birch and colleagues from 2018, who argued maybe closed skills allow for more automaticity than open skills. So I guess my argument would be, if I observe a lack of automaticity with such a closed skill, I would expect even more mental effort and task-relevant information processing in an open skill.
Okay, and so you expect more effort, and also what about the focus of attention? You expect there will be more external, internal, or a mixture of the two?
I guess more external, like we touched on in the trial lecture, more visual attunement. So in football, soccer, for example, it makes sense that the best players are scanning frequently, attending frequently, whereas in rowing, just based on my informal observations, a lot of them will use a rhythm cue, for example, more focus on timing, especially on the ergometer, where there's not too much visual information access that they can access. So I would expect different cues, but the exact cues would depend on the exact context, even in open sports.
I was interested in showing in watching this morning the video of the kick in penalty kick in soccer. Do you think there is a certain moment this penalty kick or in other situation because this is quite similar to closed skill. It's not a completely closed skill. It's a mixture of open and. Do you think the kicker at some point pay attention internally to something that would be useful for the penalty kick?
Interesting question. I have not seen any studies that go deep into internal focus in football. I could draw on some informal observations. I've worked with football players who say they focus on their bodies when they do a long pass, for example. But I think your point is interesting because it again suggests that open and closed maybe is not as clear. As you mentioned, the penalty kick is quite closed. In the sense that you can carry out the action without interference. At the same time, you are in somewhat of an interaction with an opponent. So again, I think it makes sense to think of open-close, like every task may have a degree of open aspects or closed aspects. And for example, rowing ergometer rowing may be low on the open aspects. Penalty kicks, also low, but a bit more open.
And another area is could be the changes in attentional focus as a function of, for example, increased level of fatigue or stress or unexpected events. Do you think the attentional focus will change, will be affected by these factors?
Yes, and I think you could draw on some related literature on some concepts that are closely aligned with internal, external, but they call them different things. So I think association and dissociation in endurance sports, for example, and I believe the consensus for a while was that at sub-maximal pace, you may want to focus externally, you can even distract yourself. But it comes to a point when the endurance activity becomes so intense, it seems hard to ignore. Your pain, for example, when you run max or towards the end of a marathon, it seems like you have so much buildup of pain, lactic like acids building up. You have so many sensations in your body that you may attend to. And one hypothesis would be that this can also provide information, potentially explaining why endurance runners will say they focus on their breathing, focus on their bodies. So I think fatigue that you mentioned is a very interesting concept, and again, a good reason for us to study sports in a physically demanding environment and not just golf putting and those tasks.
Yes, I think the example you provide is really interesting because both association and both dissociation strategies could be functional at the same time with the runners, especially when they are involved in longer-term running. But it could be also important the distraction. So not focusing. I mean, neither internally nor externally, but just distract for a certain... and this type of strategy have not been really investigated in deep, I mean.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, just pure distraction. And I think some findings from Whitehead and colleagues sort of shows that a lot of our thoughts are hard to place within internal, external. It can be just distraction. And we did have a measure of mind wandering in our empirical work, but I never had time to analyze it deeply. And I think the research suggests that through a typical day, we actually spend a lot of time just mind wandering. So just thinking about irrelevant things. So if you're in a cycling race that takes 4 hours or even more, I think there's no way you can stay on task the whole time. And maybe that's even good for you. Maybe it's a good thing that you take those sort of resting periods in a cognitive sense where you can just let your mind wander and stuff. I think going into that would be an interesting venue in future research.
Yeah, so we can also, from a practical point of view, examine association strategy, dissociation, and also mind wandering or individual strategies that an athlete can use for their performance. And maybe try to optimize this type of strategies.
Yes, and again, a little bit anecdotally, but Josh Waitzkin, the former chess master, he has written a book where he talks about stress and recovery. So he would give the example of him being in chess tournaments and very intensely focused all the time. And he would be fine for one game, maybe two, but then by the quarterfinal he would be fatigued. So his strategy was to actively take his mind off the chessboard, maybe get up and go for a drink and have some air, or just stare into nothing, like just let your mind disconnect for a while. I think that could be a strategy for performance.
Good. Another area of research regards the different methods that could be used to identify task-relevant information. Maybe different theoretical perspectives do not specifically mention task-relevant information, but they use, for example, biomechanical analysis or an ideographic approach, an individualized approach to identify the what, for example, could be called the core components of the action. So, do you think it would be possible to integrate your perspective with this theoretical perspective, and also use this type of methodology to identify, or other types of methodologies, biomechanical analysis, ideographic procedure, to identify the task-relevant information the athletes use?
Yeah, I mean, in one sense, I feel like we talk about the same things, but with slightly different language. But you are way more familiar with core components in that literature. But to me, it seems like you kind of start with the performer and what you need to succeed. And it's what I would recommend too is start with information. Just start with what do you want to accomplish? And where may you find the relevant information? And this may be different for two different athletes in the same sport. So the notion of core components, which to my understanding is not necessarily the most important in an objective sense. It's something they say this might be something useful to attend to. Yeah. I think that aligns nicely with the notion of task relevance, and again seems like related concepts.
Yeah. Yes, maybe the initial opinion of the athletes is not so accurate regarding this use, because they are not cannot always be aware of even coaches do not know what are the relevant information. So is also a challenge for the sports psychologists or coaches to identify the relevant information for athletes.
Yes,
yeah.
And I guess that's why these theories can work and be informative, and also, like you mentioned, biomechanical analyses, for example. I guess the whole point of that is to make the athlete aware of something they may not have realized. And I would assume a lot of the times they might have been introduced to that. And I've had that happen to myself as an athlete when you watch slow-mo film or biomechanical analyses and it makes sense, but you haven't realized it. So I think the theories and the methods that we discussed today can help bring awareness to athletes on some things they may not be consciously aware of.
There are other theoretical approaches or positions in the literature that discuss an holistic focus of attention, which is directing attention to the general feeling of the movement or sensation that are associated with the movement. And I think you mentioned something this morning regarding the rhythm or the sound or something like this. I think this would be a very good research area, also with practical indication. What do you think about the holistic perspective?
Yes, and I think I touched on that in paper number 3, the review paper, is that as far as I can tell, the most effective internal cues can sometimes be a little bit more holistic. Yeah. And your example of rhythm is a very good one. So, for example, in my sport, volleyball, when you approach, when you start playing, it feels like 4 separate steps. Mm-hmm. But after a while, it feels like just one unit, like one chunk. And I think a rhythm cue will help you guide, like, here's the whole thing, here's a holistic cue that you can sort of use as a planning tool, because I think that's a big point in the literature on external focus, like when should you focus on this cue? Yeah. And yes, you can do it like online while you do it, but it's also supposed to be a cue that you can focus on before you start. And in that case, it makes sense to start with an end goal and a holistic plan. If you want to do something, you would love to know all the steps, not just a single one. So again, just the amount of steps, the amount of task-relevant information seems very high in holistic cues, as the terminology suggests. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, also, I was thinking, for example, an athlete who found some problems in the technical execution, so he may be asked to pay particular attention at that point. And then the problem is to regain the full execution. So they may be tough to switch between the focus of attention on the specific technical part and then yes, to have an holistic approach to regain the fluidity, the rhythm of the movement.
Yes, I guess many coaches have had that experience. If you find one flaw, like one element that you want to change, if you change that, you can change the whole thing. Yeah. And I guess I don't have a very good answer for you except for acknowledging the challenge. And I guess part-whole exercises where you work with the part and then you try to integrate it into the whole is one way. But I guess you should never lose sight of the whole. That should be, again, your starting point. Start with what you want to accomplish, and then you may go into parts, but do it in a sensible way.
Yeah, that's good. Another topic would be the possible individual differences, such as skill level, but also personality traits, for example, or cognitive styles in the adoption of specific attentional focus of attention. So can we expect possible individual differences in the adoption of specific attentional focus?
Yes. Somewhere on my computer, I have data on working memory capacity for some of the athletes in my sample. And the idea was that we would integrate that into the analysis. Just to give you one example, I think, for example, higher working memory capacity, your capacity to process information in real time. One hypothesis would be if you have a high capacity, maybe you can attend to more information, more cues, and maybe even use that as Weilach talks about. If you have a high capacity for thinking, that might be a capacity for choking if you use that capacity for the wrong things. So maybe with a high working memory capacity or high cognitive capacity, maybe you have the capacity to process more information than those with lower capacity, and more importance should be put to how you use that capacity. So that's one example. And we also measured a few personality traits. It has been suggested that people high on conscientiousness, for example, hardworking people, first of all, athletes tend to score high on conscientiousness in some studies at least. And that may also influence how much you like mental effort, for example. Mental effort is, in many cases, something we don't necessarily like. but maybe there's some personality tendency for some people to be more open to spend mental effort. So conscientiousness would be one example of personality. I guess you could also argue for neuroticism or perfectionism. Reinvestment would be one example. Maybe some people have a higher prone capacity for reinvestment. They're more prone to reinvest, which would have been very relevant to my research, and admittedly a weakness in my research is I only look at groups. So this could be an interesting venue for future research.
Yeah, so some people are particularly that they feel more their body feelings. They are more they perceive the interoceptive cues more than others, are more sensitive to this. So we should take into account also this type of differences.
That's a very interesting point, and I considered the literature. It's a long time ago, so I can't remember the study, but kinesthetic sense, like how informative your body is to you or your body feel, seems like it varies between people. And I recall one study suggesting it differs quite early in life, suggesting could there be a genetic component or at least something that we develop very early, which could be why people stress physical activity, for example. Could it be that with lots of physical activity growing up, maybe you can develop better proprioception or kinesthetic senses? On a conceptual level, it makes sense. So it would be interesting to investigate that empirically as well.
In your thesis, you mentioned different theoretical perspectives, and also this morning you mentioned different theoretical approaches. Do you think is there a particular theoretical framework that could be used in particular to explain your findings, or your conceptualization could be framed within a particular theoretical framework, or you think is more general and involves different theoretical approaches? It's not an easy question.
It's a tough question, and also I feel like I would like to mention your work.
I don't.
Not just out of politeness, but
the question was not for this, for sure. I assure you.
And I also don't want to say something wrong, because you know your work more than I do, but there are a few theories, if I were to just put it in plain terms, suggest that there's more than one way to skin a cat, more than one way to perform at a high level. I think a theory in line with task-relevant information and mental effort would be that we need to account for more than one way. So implicit learning or implicit performance, constrained action seems not suited to account for different types of cases. So the map model or the must model or the notion of clutch and flow. I think a red line is that they account for more than one way. And I think that, and that could be some good theories to build on, because they give you the flexibility of more than just one category of high performance.
Okay, I am satisfied with your replies, so I think this is all at the moment, and then we'll pass to my colleague, who will be very tough with you, tougher than me. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much to the first opponent and the candidate. We will now have a 15 minutes break before inviting the second opponent. So we'll meet again at 1:15, so 12 minutes, but that should be fine. Yep. Everyone, welcome back. I hereby now yield the floor to the second opponent and the candidate. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll start off by saying Henrik's already answered most of the questions I had. So this could be a short set of questions. However, I'll try and think of some more to keep you on your toes. Claudio mentioned that I was going to ask the hard questions. I wouldn't say that. They're probably more the boring questions about methodology. So Claudio had the fun section or fun end, but I do have some kind of theoretical questions as well that I'm interested in based on this discussion. I also want to say that I really enjoyed your dissertation. I do these, I be an examiner for selfish reasons, because I get to learn about new research, so I learned a lot from reading your work, so thank you for that. So to start us off then, we'll go with the boring methodological question around sample size. So you did have quite a small sample, and I didn't notice you'd conducted any kind of priori analysis. So can you just explain kind of the rationale for your sample?
Yes, I had a feeling this would come up. So I have ran some post hoc power analyses, but I'm not going to lie, so I'll be honest first and say I did not run any a priori power analyses for this, and the main reason is that our sample was constrained and determined by the number of athletes in Team Norway. Mm-hmm. And this was during COVID, so we could not go abroad. We did have a network, so we could have gotten access to athletes in other countries, giving us a bigger elite sample, which we could have compared with a non-elite sample, but that was out of the question because of COVID.
Yeah.
I have ran some power analyses, and how poor the power was depends on the analyses we did. The good news is we had some findings with big effect sizes. In that case, it seems fairly robust. The pupil size difference, for example, seems fairly robust. I also played around with an a priori one, so just to see how many athletes would we need, because we have a complex design, right? We have skill, physical load, and mental load. In some cases, if we would expect a medium effect size and want more than 80% power, we need like 60 athletes, so completely unrealistic.
Yeah.
But this is the biggest challenge, and I could go on to say something about why I think it's a problem and why it's not a problem, but you can maybe...
I'm interested.
Do you want me to do
that?
Yeah,
I'm interested,
I think, like I said, I think the good news is we found something.
Yeah.
So there's a big chance of type 2 error, rejecting the hypothesis that could have been... we could have had the risk of saying something is non-significant where we might have expected an effect if we had a bigger sample. But I think, again, the good news is we found something. Where I do believe we could have found more things with a bigger sample is especially the interaction effects.
Yeah.
So just to give one example, we had one interaction between cognitive load and skill to see how that affected rowing kinematics, stroke lengths in particular. I think the p-value was 0.068. And the graph sort of suggested a smaller decline in elites as opposed to non-elites. And I tried to include the graph in the paper, but the reviewer said, no, just stick to whatever's significant. And that's fair enough. So I think that could have been significant. So I guess my comfort in that sense would be that small differences matter in elite sports.
Yeah.
So the small decline we saw in the elite sample might be meaningful, because to them, a small decline could be a bigger difference between winning and losing as opposed to the lower levels. So those would be my reflections on the consequences of the poor sample size, and that's obviously, arguably, our biggest weakness in this research, I think.
I wouldn't say it's a poor sample size, maybe it's just lower than you would have liked.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, suboptimal, I guess. Yeah.
So I'll probably ask this question a few times throughout my questions, but in an ideal situation, if you were kind of doing this whole project again, what would be your sample size?
Ooh. in an ideal world.
Yeah. Anything is
oh.
possible.
Woo! I would love to do a similar study, maybe across a range of different sports, see if it can be replicated in different endurance sports, for example. So one power analysis I did suggested if we could get more than 100 athletes, we could have the same design with very good power. So one way to do this would be just recruit a lot of the different elite athletes. The problem again there is that there are differences between the elites. So according to Swan and colleagues, you can categorize different classes of elites. So it would be a challenge to get this many world-class or competitive elite athletes as we would get. But in an ideal world, many, many more elite athletes, potentially even different sports.
Okay, great. You mentioned, and you've already talked about this with Claudio, about kind of the ecological validity. You know, it was not in, you know, a real world rowing environment. Again, going back to an ideal world situation, if you were to do that, you did mention some of the things that you expect to find, but can you just elaborate on that slightly?
Yes, so we wanted to do some things on water, but the eye tracking made it impossible with the light conditions.
Yeah.
But again, it would be interesting to go out into the wild and do more in on-water rowing, for example. I also talked to the local fencing community. The benefit of fencing would have been that they compete in a restricted area.
Yeah.
And I would expect to see attention to task-relevant information cues on different parts of the opponent's body, and more variability in mental effort, but more intense mental effort overall. If we did more of an open sports, and I think even rowing on water would have been way more open.
Yeah.
So just magnified effects, I guess.
Yeah, and then leading on from that, you use suboptimal kind of situations or physical loads. Have you considered, I guess, why did you use suboptimal would be my first question.
Excuse me, what?
So,
why?
Yeah, why? So why not? Why didn't your participants kind of go out and do max efforts?
Right, so partly because physical load will impact the physiological outcome measure, especially pupil size. We did have previous literature suggesting that if you increase your physical intensity, that will have an effect on pupil size. So that was part of our contribution to the field, I think, to investigate what's the relative impact of physical load and cognitive load. So partly because it was informative, and partly because we did a lot of pilots to see how high can we go. So we landed on submaximal because, one, what's going to happen with the eye trackers? If we have a lot of sweat and a lot of movement, could be a lot of noise. And also to see how high can we go and still have room for cognitive load. So I believe it would have been difficult to have the math problems and the dual task if they would have gone to what they do in a rowing race.
Yeah. Okay, jumping on to the math problem. So I'm terrible at maths, okay? And if I was rowing and you asked me to engage in some of these math problems, I might not be able to answer or solve these problems as well as Claudio, for example. How did you account for those differences? And does it matter?
Yeah, that was a concern, and the relief was that the elites and non-elites had no difference in their responses to the math problem. Several problems. So that could have been very relevant, and I sort of assumed it would be way easier for the elites. And again, our findings suggest no, they all find it very difficult, they all performed worse. So that could have been a factor, but because of our findings, I think it's not a problem in our case.
So you didn't notice some people found it more difficult than others.
Yes, there were differences, and again, I would say a weakness with my work is that I don't really focus on individual differences. I haven't really gone into analyses of differences between subjects. I focus mainly on groups.
Yeah.
Just anecdotally, the responses were very different. Objectively, I mean, some rowers almost answered correctly to almost all the questions, and some had, I guess, 5 was the lowest number. And also just their experience when they came in after a trial. Some hated the math problems, and some like, this was fun. And that would have been very interesting to go into in future work, more of the individual differences.
Yeah, okay, yeah, great. Claudio's already asked you questions around other measures that you could have taken. I'm really interested in kind of the physiological markers. So we did some similar-ish work where we captured like blood lactate, for example, to look at whether people were pushing themselves to certain levels or working at certain levels. Brain imaging, another example. Was there a reason why you chose not to use? I know we can only capture so much, and you have captured quite a lot already, but yeah, what was your rationale for that?
The pragmatic aspect you touched on was very key. Time constraints, and also the competence we have and the technology we had. And also, when I started, I read a bit of research on brain imaging suggesting this could be problematic. Cannot recall the source, but one study suggesting that EEG on a rowing ergometer would be hard, a lot of noise. But since then, I've seen the work you mentioned suggesting it could be possible with more precise techniques, and sort of an interesting future study there would be to do what we have done, some people here have done, to use eye tracking and also brain imaging during, for example, multiple object tracking. If we could have done a similar thing in sports, used eye tracking and the imaging techniques, I think we could have been more precise in terms of what exactly is going on. We can say there's mental effort going on. With those techniques, I think you could be more specific about, for example, prefrontal cortex and those details.
And I know you didn't do this, so this is a bit of a tough question, but what might you expect to find if you were to use kind of brain imaging as an example, like in the prefrontal cortex?
To speculate, just based on the work you mentioned, and also one study, again, I can't recall the authors, but they have investigated biathlon. So you're fatigued, and then you're shooting, and I believe one study suggested more frontal activity in elites. If I were to base my predictions on my findings, I would have seen that as conceivable, that you could have had more cortical activation in certain areas, maybe not others. So different areas being involved.
That's your next study with your supervisors.
Was that?
That's your next study with your supervisors.
Hopefully, that would be amazing. We'll need a lot of pilots for that, though. But it would be interesting.
Okay, great. You let participants set their own race plan. Do you foresee any, or did you see any issues with that? So I guess my thought around that is, if I'm an elite rower, my race plan might be more familiar to me, whereas if I'm, a lower level, it might be something I'm thinking about more. Did you see any kind of differences there?
That's a very interesting point, and the graph that Robatza showed with the pupil sizes sort of suggested descriptively that mental effort actually went down, going from low to medium in the elite sample, while it went up in the non-elite. So that would be evidence, if that would have been significant, that would have been evidence of what you say, that it's more familiar to use a race plan if you're elite. And there's all kinds of issues with that condition. In reality, the athletes had different task conditions because they used a different plan. And we had many discussions on this, and I guess the reason why I went with that idea was to avoid the problems with the attentional focus effect research, where you have prescribed. We sort of considered prescribing, here's what you should think about, but to tell Olympic champions, here's your cue. And I don't know anything about rowing. felt a bit odd, so I went with the more open variable approach.
Yeah. Okay, understandable.
Yeah.
And look, talking about the eye tracking now, I know this is quite a new area, and I work with quite a lot of colleagues that do a lot of work in this area, and I actually shared with them your work, and some of my colleagues said, okay, there's a lot of other variables that can account for change in pupil size and blink rate. And I know your work really supports the use of this, and you're suggesting we look at this in future, but do you think, or was there any other potential explanations for the results that you found? Or do you see any issues?
Lots of potential issues, and my study is only one study, so I would love to see more work on this before I sort of go into any sports environment and say this is what it is. So there could be a few things that people have suggested to me that could explain why the elites had larger dilations. One is motivation.
Yeah.
They come in more motivated to exert effort as their preparation for the Olympics. Physical effort in an objective sense, even though we based it on their personal capacity, could it be that because of their, in an objective sense, higher physical effort, could that explain why you had more pupil dilation? And I think I would love to see more work on the role of physical effort and its effect on pupil size before I say anything, but those are two options, motivation and physical load.
Yeah, I agree. I'm going to move into some more kind of theoretical questions and some that you've already touched on. I'm quite familiar with reinvestment theory. So according to that theory, if expert performers in high-pressured situations, if they feel like kind of stress or valuation apprehension, might revert back to more early or novice kind of technique, which is evidenced in some of the literature that you've mentioned. And you demonstrated that your higher level group reverted back to, or the kinematics changed as a result of dual processing. How do we know that's not a result of kind of feeling stressed, or and this group could have a high propensity for reinvestment?
Very interesting. I haven't thought that much about those findings under that lens. I think it's interesting to bring in reinvestment, and I would have to think more about that, but I think it could be a case where you see the kinematic changes as an effect of stress, and I think it's very hard to separate stress from mental effort, because when you give me a hard math problem, I won't just exert mental effort and think, I would also be stressed. Like, stress is part of mental effort. And we had a questionnaire, the NASA Task Load Index, and it has this item on frustration. And I haven't ran any correlation analyses, but my guess would be when mental effort goes up, frustration also tends to go up. And in the dual task, a lot of them were frustrated, some more than others. But the distinction between the physiological arousal or stress and mental effort in terms of cognitive activity is very hard to separate. And I think Kahneman touched on this in his 1973 book as well, in the case that mental effort is a specific type of stress or arousal, and you cannot really disentangle the two completely. So I think the stress you mentioned could be a very interesting way to explain the findings.
Okay, great. And we talked about directing of attention and endurance performance earlier on, and you talk about Christian Swan's work and Patricia Jackman, who look at flow and clutch. So can you explain, so in my mind there's a real connection there between internal, external focus and flow and clutch. I guess my question is, do you see that connection also?
I could see that connection, and I think there are studies suggesting that internal focus can have a higher cognitive load, so maybe it could be associated with clutch.
Yeah.
And as far as I can understand, clutch also happens under pressure. You may need to make some adjustments. Maybe that can invite an internal focus because you like your technique is a little bit off that day, you need to make an adjustment. I could see that leading to more internal focus, whereas when everything is just flowing and it's your perfect day and everything is good, I would see more external focus because you don't really have to make that much adjustment. It makes sense on a conceptual level, I think.
Yeah, I agree, and I must say I kind of only connected that from reading your thesis and this conversation. And that links back to when we look at flow, if we look at elite performers, it's really difficult to study that because it's a rare thing that we experience. And you've mentioned in your thesis that it's very much a retrospective report. We find that information out afterwards. But when we think about, if we take what you've done and put this into like a kind of a novice or a recreational person starting an activity like running, we would want to encourage flow because we want it to be pleasant and pleasurable. What kind of practical applications or recommendations could you take from your work that might apply to other contexts, such as, new runners?
Yeah, very interesting question. And just to touch on flow first, I think it's hard to put my head around if it's a low effort or high effort. I guess it would depend on subjective or objective measures, because the definition of flow is intense attention to whatever you do, which would seem to align with high mental effort, which is intensive attention. So in one sense, I think flow can be misunderstood in the sense that it's all like low effort. But in terms of the practical application, I think it seems strange to start with the idea, go with high effort for effort's sake. I think that's like saying to an endurance athlete, just run fast or use high physical intensity for its own sake. It doesn't make sense. So I would start with information, or the goal, like start with, what do you try to accomplish? Who are you? And based on who you are, your attributes and personality and characteristics, try to predict where's the most task relevant information, motivate, set some goals. If you go with task relevant information and you're motivated, I think you'll see mental effort, and it could be experienced more pleasurable than just, here's the task, do it.
Yeah. And leading on from that, in terms of practical recommendations, if I'm a coach working with, we'll take rowers as an example, what are your recommendations to me in terms of the type of internal and external focus that I might demonstrate or use in my coaching with my athletes?
There's a nice study from 2013 suggesting that the cues that are more meaningful and familiar to you will be more effective. So that study showed internal can work, external can also work. So I would, again, this will be a bit of repetition from my last answer, where I just start with, what's your goal? Who are you? It was a very good point on kinesthetic information. Maybe that varies. So maybe some will be more prone to follow that. I know we had some rowers in our sample who used sound a lot. Some even had musical backgrounds. Could that be the reason? So I would start with the task and the person, analyze what could be the cues for this individual based on their unique style, characteristics, preference, and so on.
Okay. So where do we go next from here, from your work?
Would love to be even more specific, to go and see, I think we need to go beyond external, internal, for example. I think that's not very interesting, especially if you have poorly designed studies with imbalanced information. So, like I hopefully touched on in my trial lecture, go even more specific. Specifically, what is it that can be an effective cue? And more ecological validity. I hope that my biggest contribution is demonstrating that we can use eye tracking and different measures under high cognitive load. So not so much golf putting, so more specificity, more ecological validity, even higher intensity, more open sports, that would be my recommendation.
Okay. And last question. Intervention studies, what would they look like in this area?
I can start by saying what I don't think they should look at, and I would be very skeptical of using too much implicit training with dual tasking. I know that's been used to train, to assess athletes, and if my sample declines under high cognitive load, I wouldn't expect this to be not an activity you should use every practice session, since it seems to affect technique. So I would not use dual task with a high cognitive load very much, maybe sometimes if you have a good reason for it. But instead I would go with variability and see, can you explore some new things, like was touched on, maybe they're not aware of the opportunities with different cues. Differential learning, I think, is interesting, where the athlete just tries different things. Constraint-led approaches, where you guide the athletes towards a new solution. The red line there, to me, is that you explore information. You explore new cues, new sources of information, and that can be eye-opening.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
That was great. Yeah, good.
Thank you. So I would like to thank the second opponent and the candidate. You can please be seated. So no one has asked to speak as an ex auditorio opponent. If anyone wishes to do so, please let me know now. I will wait for a few seconds. No? Would the candidate like to make any closing remarks or say thank you to anyone? Okay.
So this will be a improvised clutch performance under pressure. No, I just want to say thank you so much to the committee who has come here in person, especially after COVID. I really appreciate this, and also thank you, Tor. This was very positive experience for me. I've never done this before, obviously. Very strange day to talk about things that at least my family probably will not understand too much of. And no offense. To have this day where all of a sudden people attend to what you do, you don't get too much information, too much attention to all your work normally. So this is a big day, and when you don't do sports anymore as an athlete, this is the closest thing to being in the arena, I guess. So it was very, very positive. I would like to thank the organizers. Very good job and very positive experience for me. Thank you to my supervisors for all the trust and help, and all my colleagues, friends, people I don't know, but obviously care enough to show up today and appreciate and attend to what I say. It's very heartwarming, very positive experience for me, so thank you.
Thank you. So this concludes the defense. The rector of the University of Oslo and also the university board will be notified. That's the formalities. Yeah. So also on behalf of the Department of Psychology and the Faculty of Social Sciences, I would like to congratulate you. There will now be a reception, I was told, in the kitchen area of Ritmo Center, which is outside of this room and downstairs, and I would like to encourage everyone to attend this one. There will be a few drinks and some food. Yeah. So final words, congratulations, Henrik.